All right, guys. So today we're gonna talk about the secrets of the universe, right? So the reason why I'm making this video is just because, I try to look online and it seems like no one has figured this out. Like scholars haven't figured this out, archaeologists haven't figured this out. So this history, I'm gonna give you guys a blueprint of basically human history, right? Like who were the first humans, and how, and basically what I found out was, you know, evolution theory, and basically final revelation, basically the revelation type religions that basically prove that Adam was the first human. Um, I want to kind of dissect how this actually works in the actual evolution theory of science. So we're going to bridge science with basically religion, or basically revelation, which is basically from God. So so that's the thing, guys. Because a lot of people, either atheists think in evolution theory, they just think in the science, and then the religious people are just kind of like, oh, no, 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 we just believe in the texts, right? And well, I only care about objective reality, right? And I don't think anyone has been able to bridge both together, because people haven't able to. I don't think there's been people that have articulated basically why human evolution actually doesn't contradict the revelation of religions, and how the revelation actually support the idea of Adam, right? Without dismissing archaeological evidence of Homo sapiens, right? So this is going to be about the secrets of the universe. You know what I mean? And this is basically purely based off divine pattern recognition that I basically thought of, and I've basically been connecting dots, and I thought this would be interesting for you guys to see. So, was Adam actually the first human? And this is I'm gonna give you guys a timeline, okay, of the human history and how it happens, and how it actually makes sense in the grand scheme of existence, right? Of how the universe works. So, this is basically my kind of prediction, but it's I'm very sure that this prediction is actually very accurate, just based off all the pieces we're gonna put together, right? And I'm gonna explain one by one why these things make sense, and how it can make sense in your worldview of basically how science and revelation coexist. So my hypothesis, well, this is already proven by science with archaeological evidence, but basically 100,000 years ago were the first anatomical humans. So basically, the first biological humans on Earth were basically, they call them the Homo sapiens, right? So we can find fossils basically 100,000 years ago of basically humans that existed 100,000 years ago, right? So it's around 100,000, 200,000 years ago, roughly around the time frame when the first humans, the first biological humans actually emerged, right? And these, keep in mind, guys, these are kind of the hunter-gatherers, right? Kind of era, the Paleolithic era, right? Now, a lot of people in religion just assume that okay, so that means that Adam must have been one of those first Paleolithic people. And the reason why I say this doesn't make sense is because with the timeline of the prophets, because you have to keep in mind that the prophets basically started with Adam and they ended with Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So we have a lineage of prophets, right? And we know about Prophet Adam and Noah, right? And basically, it wouldn't make sense for there to be 100,000 year gap between Adam and Noah. And the reason is because, that amount of length could basically bring about entire civilizations, So I do think that well, how do we figure this out? It's how do we know that Adam, so was Adam the first human? And the answer is kind of. Because Adam, so the differences between the Homo sapiens 100,000 years ago and the Adam that we know today, that God basically called the first human, was not biological. So what does it mean? So Adam is not actually the first biological human. He's not the first biological Homo sapien. But you know what he is? He's the first morally awake human. So this is the difference between the science and the religion. The revelation, I'm basing all my information off basically the final revelation, guys, because that's the final one, right? So, but the Adam, so Adam, the final revelation says basically Adam is the first human, basically the first morally accountable human. So this means that there was a transition, a big leap between biological Homo sapiens and Adam himself. And if you guys, and you know, you have to keep in mind that like humans today all have morals. Like we all have morals, right? We all have universal morals, as in like, you know, we agree that we shouldn't kill people, or that, you know, doing like, there's just certainly moral things that we shouldn't do as humans, right? And that we all intrinsically agree upon. That's universal to human. You know, like we shouldn't kill people, we shouldn't do like, you know, basically incest, like all these crazy things, right? Like these are things that like we already know is wrong to do. Like we shouldn't do these things, right? It's already embedded us. It's basically this moral compass that's given to us, to humanity. Now, when we observe the archaeological evidence of the Homo sapiens that existed like 100,000 years ago, we don't know if these people, if these humans actually had a moral compass. We don't know if they were actually morally accountable. Like, what if these Homo sapiens were literal animals? And that's what I actually think this is. The Homo sapiens before Adam were actually not human at all, in the sense of like morally human. They are biologically human. They had the same heart, the same like digestive system, the same functions, the same bones, right? But they didn't have the same morality, right? Basically, the spirit of humans that we have today. You know, like there's certain morals that we have, and those morals came from Adam, right? And basically, Adam was the first morally awake human. So that would be the transition from the Paleolithic Homo sapiens to the first morally awakened human, Adam. So keep in mind that there's a difference between the non-awake humans and the awake humans, because Adam was the first human with fitra, the first human with the actual like moral compass. So that's what we know with Adam. So that was basically 15,000 years ago. So I estimate that like this timeline, like the first Adam, basically the first morally awake human, which was Adam, he existed 15,000 years ago, and then the Homo sapiens, the biological humans, existed like 100,000 years ago. So way before, which means that Adam is still relatively recent. So that's something to keep in mind. And then we have basically Noah. So that's the next prophet, guys. Noah is the next prophet. He's the guy that built the ark. If you guys don't know, like he basically warned basically the first major civilization. Basically, after Adam, there's a couple thousand years that for like them to reproduce, and basically eventually by the time Noah came around, which I would estimate around like 10,000 years ago, right? So basically there's 5,000 years of like kind of like repopulating from Adam, right? Of the first major like morally human civilization, like basically the first civilization that like basically the Noah warned about. So Noah was a prophet, and he basically warned these people that the flood was coming, right? And basically, if you guys don't know about this, like what this was gonna do, guys, the flood, because I was trying to think like, okay, so we're all descendants of Noah, because according to Revelation, God wiped out every single human except for the survivors of Noah. So we are actually all descendants of Noah, right? Now, what did the flood do? Like, what did you guys think was the purpose of the flood? Like, why would God actually flood like most of the earth, right? Or at least like flood a part of the earth that was like the most, like, like why would he do that? Like, why would God actually do something like that? And this is actually why I think God actually had a flood. Why, he basically told Noah to build the ark and everything. It's because, remember how I talked about the Homo sapiens before Adam, right? Which are basically the non-morally awake humans, basically the pure animal humans, right? People that, the Homo sapiens that didn't have morals, they were just purely animal, versus like the morally awake human, which is Adam, right? Well, what the flood did with Noah was the flood wiped out, first of all, like most of disbelievers that didn't believe in Noah. They basically just got all drowned. But what this flood was really meant to do, it was meant to actually kill all of the non-morally awake humans. So remember, I made a distinction between a morally awake human and an actual fitra human, like Adam. So why does all of humanity today seem to have like all like morals? Like why does everyone awake, like alive today, seem to have some like morals, but like we can't find any human that's purely animalistic, like the way like animals are. You know what I mean? And I think that's because with the Noah's flood that happened like roughly 10,000 years ago, that wiped out the non-morally awake humans. So then this will make sense, because because here's the thing: if there's a transition from biological to spiritual transformation from the humans before Adam and after, then we would have to like know, okay, well, where did these Homo sapiens that were not spiritually awake, basically they didn't have morals, they were just basically purely animals in a sense, where did these people go? Because they're still biologically human, like they will still roam around the earth, right? But what this flood does is it actually wiped out all the humans that were basically non-morally awake. So that explains that all of humanity, at least today, are actually direct descendants of Noah because of this. So now that basically think about Noah's flood as like basically the total reset of it's basically the total global reset, right? And basically after Noah's flood, this is where this gets interesting. Over the course of the next 5,000 years, we have people that basically migrate out to different civilizations. So now we basically have 5,000 years later. So basically, the survivors of Noah, they'll basically spread, and these were the foundation of the early civilizations. So if you guys don't know, the most ancient civilizations like ever in existence, basically humans were like basically the ancient Mesopotamia. So that happened like roughly 5,000. So this is like spot on my timeline, right? I said Noah's flood happened 10,000 years ago, and then it took 5,000 years roughly to at least form the early ancient civilizations we know of today, right? Basically ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, ancient China, like in the Yellow River, right? And in the Indus Valley civilization, which is like in the Indias, right? So basically all the Indians that we know of today, South Asians, are descendants of basically the Indus Valley civilization. And then we have like the civilization in China and in East Asia. So basically these were like the Asians came from. And then we basically have like some of the other guys that went over to like the Americas. And then that's where like the Aztec and the Mayan like civilization started to form. So that's where you find like the Native Americans, the indigenous people, like, so these people were actually basically from Noah. So basically after Noah, these humans is basically dispersed across the globe over the course of like 5,000 years. And that's basically what basically formed like, Egypt, Indus, and ancient China. And this basically is how we are all biologically the same, but we look so different. So why do Asians look like Asians? Why do Indians look Indians? Why do, white people look like white? Like why do these happen? This basically happened through basically over time as like different climates and change and migration. Humans started to look a little bit different, but they were still biologically the same. Like, have you guys ever noticed, like, like how we look so different, yet we're like still biologically like the same in every way, like in terms of digestive system? It's because like the flood that happened 10,000 years ago, like, well, we're the survivors of that. So we only have 10,000 years. We're basically descendants of people that lived for like basically 10,000 years ago. So it's very recent. And there's also another scientific theory that came out that actually proves Noah's flood. That actually the flood exists. Something like a flood-like event probably did happen. And that's known as the DNA bottleneck. So this is basically the DNA bottleneck, guys. It's basically the studies that show humanity's effective population size that shrank dramatically during this time. So they were basically like testing out these genes, right? So there are basically people that said, okay, all modern humans descend maternally from a woman 100,000 years ago, but there's evidence of a massive reduction in diversity around 1,000 to 15,000 years ago, matching the post-flood period. So yes, we do have like kind of basically biological genetics of Homo sapiens 100,000 years ago, but there's evidence of a massive reduction in diversity, basically like, in terms of gene expression and like basically genetic diversity that happened roughly 10,000 years ago. So imagine if like only like 70 people after the flood of Noah were basically the only humans on Earth. And that happened like very recently, like 10,000 years ago. So this would actually match, this bottleneck window actually proves evidence of something happening in humanity where like just the diversity of the genetics is completely shrink, right? So basically, some people say that some only estimate a few hundred humans survived globally, genetic diversity slowly rebuilt afterward, but radiating from a single ancestral population. So basically, the Fitra-bearing descendants of Noah repopulated the earth after a mass extinction, after the flood. So if you guys actually test all of our DNA, it goes back, basically, it's very similar and goes back to the mitochondrial Eve, which is basically the massive reduction in genetic diversity. So this is actually very radical. This is actually really interesting because it's like, okay, well, so science shows that like there was a massive reduction in diversity of humanity, which would make sense. Like if you're like close to extinction, bro, like, you know what I mean? Of course there will be a massive reduction in diversity of humans, but that's what happened. And then we basically, over the course of 5,000 years, we basically formed the ancient civilizations. Now, what I wanted to know was like, okay, well, how long biologically would it take for someone like that looks like, basically like a Middle Eastern guy, for him to take him to look like an Asian? Like, how long would it take for a Middle Eastern guy to like have the facial structure and eyes of like an Asian versus a white person versus a black person versus an Indian? Like, how would that change in the face like happen? Like, how long would it take for the adaptation of like the pigments and like someone to look like a race? Like, we can tell who's Asian today, we can tell who looks white or who looks like Middle Eastern. Like, we can tell who looks like what race, right? Based on how they look, right? And obviously, I base this information based on the final revelation, which is basically the Quran, right? And what the Quran's, and you have to keep in mind that like Allah can perform miracles that seem very like basically miracles, right? Things that might seem out of reach, because like, if I were to actually like, according to like some of the scientists, like it'll take a super long time for your face to go from Middle Eastern to completely Asian. Like it'll take like like a couple like 1,000 years, but we only have 5,000 years. So basically within like the basically dispersion of the 5,000 years after the post-flood of Noah, we have the ancient civilizations like actually gathering. But like within that 5,000 period of time, that's when humanity started to look very different. We have Asian and stuff. So within a 5,000 year time frame, we basically somehow God managed to basically, through climate and through migration and through like a bunch of other various factors that we probably don't know about, we have the ethnic and cultural diversity of humanity. And this is actually confirmed in the Quran, right? The Quran basically says, we made you into nations so that you may know each other, right? Something like that, right? So basically the diversity of humanity is a deliberate design in God's basically structure of the universe. Like basically God decided to make humanity diverse, right? So this is something that actually, like we made you into nations and tribes. Basically, this is Surah 49, verse 17. We made you into nations and tribes, right? So that you may know one another. So, and then Allah also says, of the signs, they're the creations of, basically they're the signs of Allah with the diversity of the tongues and the colors, right? So the reason why God made us into different colors and different languages is to basically show the diversity of humanity expressed in the same oneness. So basically, like no matter how diverse humanity gets, right, it still expresses the same oneness of God, right? And that's probably why God decided to make us diverse, right? Is to show us how different we can become culturally, yet contain the same essence. So this is when I say that humanity can be united under the essence, because our essence comes from the descendants of Noah, Adam, right? So we have the same essence of humanity, right? Which is basically the moral compass that we have within us. So what unites us is our moral fitra. It's our moral compass that descended from Adam, right? We're different than the Homo sapiens that archaeologists found, right? Because there's a difference between a biological human and a morally awake human, right? There's a very massive transformation. Like you don't notice it biologically on the surface, but there's like a very shift in like internal transformation for like when Adam was the first basically human after that, right? So that's the thing, guys. So basically, if you want to re-summarize the timeline, basically 100,000 years ago, the Homo sapiens appeared. Then 15,000 years ago, Adam, the first human, was born. Then around 10,000 years ago, maybe 12,000 years ago, Noah basically was basically warning like basically his first civilization, right? From Adam. And then 10,000 years ago, he built the ark. The flood happened. Boom, massive extinction of the non-morally awake humans. And then now the only humans alive are basically the people that were on the boat. And then from there, over the course of 5,000 years, humanity spread out to Asia, to South Asia, right? To basically the Americas, and the Middle East and everything, right? So now we have the diversity of humanity, right? It comes from this, guys. So, and then basically after that, that's when we start to form, 5,000 years ago, that's when we start to, have the rise of like the ancient civilizations that we know of today, like, Egypt, Indus, so all these things. So this actually timeline would kind of match when humans were actually first born, and how we can actually use science to actually prove that, okay, maybe Adam was the first human, but like he wasn't the first biological human. So this is what I want to point out, because like archaeologists say, oh, well, there was humans that existed like, hundreds of thousands of years ago, but like we don't know for sure if these humans were actually morally awake, because you all you can analyze are just fossils and bones, and like, oh, okay, so these humans, like, they kind of seem to like work like us. They seem to like look like us. Yes, there are humans that looked like us, like, 15,000 years ago, of course. But I'm not saying, but just because they existed doesn't mean they're the first morally awake humans. There's a difference. They could have been just purely animalistic. You know what I mean? Like if a human died, like if one of the relatives died, like they wouldn't care. Like they would mourn, not because their relative died. They would just basically maybe feel sad because like they lost a tool for hunting, for example. Like, you know what I mean? Like I'm talking like that level of like the degradation of the moral compass. So what actually makes us unique in humanity is having a moral compass, is having our essence, right? Which is basically the fitra, the actual innate compass in us. And that's what happened with Adam. So this is basically like my kind of hypothesis with how, when humanity became, and how basically evolution theory doesn't actually contradict revelation. It actually confirms and elevates it, right? So we have several things like, the anatomy. We basically, this is how my stuff supports evolution theory, right? Humans evolved from earlier hominids over hundreds of thousands of years. So boom, the anatomy of humans accepted, because Homo sapiens existed 100,000 years ago. I just said that. Then we have the behavior evolution, so gradual emergence of language and tools. So this basically fits, but then it marks, recently, like 10,000 years ago or 15,000 years ago, we have a sudden spiritual leap with Adam as the first morally awake human. And then we have the bottleneck DNA evidence, where like basically a massive reduction in population, 10,000 years ago. So this matches basically the post-Noah's flood. So we know that like our genetics are actually very similar to the exact humans that existed 10,000 years ago. So we know that, okay, there was an extinct population. So we basically have proof there. And then from there, we basically have out of Africa migrations, basically, post-flood, people spread into separate civilizations, tribes, and stuff. So, basically, evolution explains the physical shell, revelation explains the soul. So, this is all makes sense now. Now, basically, the reality of this universe makes sense now. You know what I mean? Because you have to keep in mind that science observes what is, but it doesn't explain, like, why. You know what I mean? So now we know why, Adam was basically the first morally awake human. And if you're like an atheist and you like think like, okay, well, like prove that like Adam was like the first morally awake human. Well, you can't prove that those Homo sapiens, that you analyze with the fossils, you can't prove that these humans were actually morally awake. You can't really tell. Like for who like you probably don't realize like maybe like these humans like they didn't have morals. Like they just basically weren't really humans, even though they were biologically human. You know what I mean? Like they wouldn't be like us in the same sense, right? So this would actually make a lot of sense now. You know what I mean? Because I just separated between the difference between a biological human and then a morally awake human with the same biology. And then how the flood wiped out all the non-awake humans, all basically the humans that weren't morally accountable. Because if we would have had like 10,000 years, if basically Homo sapiens existed for 100,000 years, they'll be roaming somewhere, right? If this was true. But like I said, the post-flood flooded them out, so it killed all of them. So now this would actually make sense. It's like this explains how like the non-awake Homo sapiens, like where they are and how they existed with Adam, and how we are still descendants of Adam. So the flood actually makes sense. The flood actually confirms everything, because it's like then it basically explains how humanity got reset, and how there were no humans that didn't have morality, So basically the humans that were basically animals were wiped out, in a sense, if that makes sense, right? So yeah, guys, this would actually make a lot of sense, but this is basically, so this is basically like my my worldview of how how humanity is actually united despite our diversity, and that was like an intentional design, guys. Like God made us diverse for a reason after Noah. You know what I mean? So like I would say like the true diversity of humanity started after Noah. And in front, but we still have that same unity, guys. So yeah, guys, this is something that this bridges between evolution theory, bottleneck theory, like it basically bridges the science with the actual revelation religion. And now we know why Adam was, how we are descendants of Adam, right? But confirming evolution theory, because I just said we have to make the distinction between a morally awake human like Homo sapiens and a morally awake human like Adam. So Adam was the first morally awake one, and we're the descendants of Adam from there. So yeah, guys, this actually makes a lot of sense. And you tell me guys what you think, because I think this is like very important, and I don't think like a lot of people talk about this, but I think with everything that I basically made these points and connected everything together. So I hope basically this makes sense, because what I described was like pretty I kind of find it like fascinating. I'm like, yo, so I kind of now I kind of understand how humanity like works now, like, you know what I mean, like how human history evolved, so it's kind of interesting.